Hello, everyone. My name is Samuel Ryman, and this is Samuel's Racing Show, and I am joined from Colorado by Mr. Joe Peak.
Hey, Sam. Thanks for having me on the show again.
I'm glad you're here because, Joe, in the past, we have not hidden our biases. You know, I'm a bit of a Ferrari fan. You're a bit of a Mercedes, Lewis Hamilton fan at times. And I'm jumping on the bandwagon. You can see my green shirt, rooting for Aston Martin for next season because those drivers seem to do pretty well this weekend. But we'll get into that in a moment because even though Vettel and Stroll and Sainz and Perez and Leclerc all put on decent performances this weekend, there was one that was worthy of a championship legendary drive. And I think, honestly, it's appropriate that Lewis Hamilton wrapped up his seventh championship last weekend and is now not only a seven-time champion, but arguably going to be a legend of the sport in the future.
Yeah, and I think that's what hit me emotionally in that race is everything coming together kind of in that perfect storm. Because in past championships that he's won, it seemed like even though obviously he was appreciative, I think myself, fans, and Lewis himself kind of felt everything wash over them when this one hit, not just the accomplishment, but what it took to wrap it up.
I don't think there was anyone really who didn't have a reason to be happy at the end of a race unless they're purely a Red Bull fan. Ferrari fans happy about Ferrari's result. I'm sure even Lance Stroll was happy that the team got a decent result. And I think anyone who cares about racing or the history of racing was happy that someone did clinch such a legendary accomplishment with such a fantastic drive. And I know media outlets have been harping on about this and people all across social media. And I think we need to do the same here because that was the story of a weekend. It almost reminds me of One Manuel Fangio. I don't know how well fans know their F1 history, but Fangio was the first driver to be a multi-champion, really, in an F1 when he won his record fifth championship at the 1957 German Grand Prix. It was with a race where he overcame a 30-second deficit or so in the wet at the older Nürburgring and ended up going from third to first, I think, on the final lap to win. And of course, 60 years later, F1 historians still talk about that race. I don't see any reason why they wouldn't do the same with what we saw on Sunday in Turkey.
I kind of expect so too. And it's funny that you mentioned, feeling good after that one, because I know I texted you as soon as I finished watching the race and saying how happy I was for Vettel. Those were exactly my thoughts that, man, how could you not be happy for that one? Feeling good for Perez, proving his worth, feeling good for Vettel, returning to form. And then, of course, for Hamilton, for what he had achieved. Um, and I really do hope that that goes down as one of the races in the history of the sport. It had just about everything in it. And more than that, I heard a lot in the broadcast that I watched with Martin Brundle saying he loved seeing the drivers have to drive the cars. And I agree. I think that's what made it phenomenal is it really took all the skill of everybody out there to perform as well as they did. And that's what I think should have left the fans with their jaws on the floor the most is just all this talk about, F1 being the greatest in the world. Well, they proved that, I think, this weekend.
Now, anyone who's watched this show before may have noticed that I am in a bit of a different location. I'm in Georgia now because I have a new job. That job requires me to work 6 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Sundays at the moment. That's a problem because Formula One started at 5 a.m. So what I did on Sunday, Joe, was I watched the first 13 laps of a race until the virtual safety car was deployed for Antonio Giovinazzi breaking down, which incredibly was the only virtual safety car and or safety car of the entire race. Kudos to the entire field for keeping it clean in such low grip conditions. But the point I was trying to make, I watched the first 13 laps. I'm like, boy, this is a good race. Even if Lewis Hamilton wins the championship, I do not want anything to spoil this race. I had my cell phone on for airplane mode at 10 hours at work. Told all my colleagues, who I know don't care about Formula One anyway, but told all of them, do not spoil Formula One for me. One person comes in at 4 o'clock and says, man, I saw what happened in the race. So Lewis Hamilton started in sixth place, and I stopped him right there. And I'm like, oh crap, he mentioned Lewis Hamilton started in sixth place. That means he did something impressive. And I'm like, either he won the championship or he won the race. And then I got back home and I was watching as far as lap 20, and I'm like, there's no way he won the race. My colleague was just saying, oh, yeah, I saw Lewis Hamilton won the championship from sixth place. I'm like, okay, all right, I can't sit down, watch this race now. Hamilton's not going to win. Lap 30, 40. Okay, Hamilton might win. And then, oh, he's smoked him. How did it happen?
It's funny because I had a similar experience where I almost always have to watch on a tape delay, just because partly because I'm lazy, but partly because I'm usually busy on weekends doing commentary stuff. And on this one, I keep my social media separate so I can kind of check in with friends and stuff that don't follow motorsports and not have to worry about spoiling races. And I just happened to come across the Twitter news function, and they said something to the effect of Lewis Hamilton makes history, which wasn't like with you, is like wasn't too much of a spoiler, but I was like, quickly close it and like, okay, I don't want to see anything of this, because I knew I had heard murmurings of, it's going to rain, if there was rain, and it's like, ooh, this is going to be a good one based on what qualifying was like. But it's that is one of, like you said, it was kind of one of those races where nothing was for sure. And I think I go over this a lot, that the best races are the ones that are unpredictable, not necessarily chaos, but you just simply don't know what's coming. And that's what makes sport interesting, is because this is a story that's unfolding live and nobody knows the ending. So we're all on our seats waiting to see what that next turn is. And the races we wind up talking about the most are the ones that nobody expected them to unfold that way. And this is a perfect example that there were so many unknowns, and it wasn't necessarily the up and down nature of it, but just that, oh, what's going to happen now that this has happened, and what's happened now that this driver's done this that nobody saw coming, things like that.
The frustrating thing for me, Joe, because I admit I turned the TV off quickly after the race finished. Uh, and the reason why is because not because I didn't think Hamilton didn't deserve a win, or not because I think he didn't deserve a championship, or not because I didn't think, man, I just watched a really historic race. Hamilton deserved that. I feel happy for him. I think I felt all those sins. The reason I turned the TV off is I'm like, how the hell do you stop this guy? It's like you say, it was absolutely unpredictable. And we have seen that probably about 4 or 5 races this season where you couldn't have wrote the story that happened in the race. Hamilton winning on 3 tires comes to mind. And every time it's absolutely crazy. And Hamilton's not always winning the battles, but at the end of the day, he's winning the war.
Yeah, and I thought that afterwards too, because there was some discussion about, oh well, he does have the best car, et cetera, et cetera. And yes, I agree. And I will accept that that is an advantage. And I think I've made the similar criticism of Schumacher. I think the thing that needs to be pointed about these types of drivers that have gone down as some of the greatest is that they are with teammates who are in the same, if not extremely similar equipment. And their teammates aren't multi-time champions. You think about Nico Rosberg, he won one. And how many would he have won if he had stayed in? It took him what, till the third season to clinch it, I think it was,
Yeah.
with Mercedes dominance. Yeah, in 2016. And then look at Bottas. I mean, poor guy. It seems a bit like Barrichello in that, I think I can't remember if this is an exact quote or if it was a different driver that I'm thinking of, but someone, one of them pointed out that, Barrichello may have gotten trounced, but how many wins did he get that he wouldn't have got if he was in another team? It's kind of one of those things where you take your chance when you've got it. And yeah, maybe Valtteri is getting a little bit trounced, but he's also having a career that I don't think he otherwise would have had. And it does highlight also what Hamilton is doing in comparison to someone who has that same advantage.
I think Rosberg was a stronger rival to Hamilton. I
I
don't
agree.
know. I don't know if he continued. Would have he won a second championship? But we'll never be able to say, unfortunately. Um, Obviously, it wasn't a good race for Bottas. I have to imagine at some point he went a little bit different on the setup for the car to be handling that poorly. Um, but with that regards, it's easy to say, well, maybe Hamilton dialed in a setup that was good in the long run. And if that was the case, then kudos to him. But why didn't we see the pace in qualifying or in practice, when the conditions were slippery then as well? He bided his time. That wasn't a drive where he went out and he just outpaced everyone. He had to out racecraft them as well. And that's not necessarily Hamilton we would have seen 10 years ago or so. And the problem for me, as a guy who likes to see other people win, is that racecraft is something that you only get better at with age. And there is no reason right now to expect that anyone other than Hamilton will win the 2021 championship.
Yeah, it's looking pretty likely. Although I guess the commentator in me who wants to make sure that there's still drama says you just don't know because something could happen, and we'll see. It's you know you talk about out strategizing. You made the comparison to Fangio earlier. It was incredibly similar to that because Fangio had to change the way he drove those last few laps. I believe the story goes that he was a gear higher every corner than what he was prior to make up the time lost and do the faster laps. And you look at Lewis, basically basically going from flat out all the time to, like you said, having to measure the pace. And it's interesting if you listen to the drivers afterwards. I know you said you missed the post race. A lot of the drivers said that part of what allowed them to continue was that they were racing on slicks by the end. They genuinely had slicks on that just had a little bit of tread on the corners of the tires, and that's what allowed them to go faster than those who pitted at the end. And you think, if Lewis had gone in and pitted, it would have been a completely different story. Maybe we would have seen Perez win that race. We don't know. Um, and it's funny because he even Lewis made mention that part of the reason he did not come in, because they even called him in at the very end to say, put these on just to be safe because it might rain. He said his mind went back to China in 2007 when he lost his potential chance at a first championship against Raikkonen and Alonso, and he binned it going into pit for tires, and he had worn them out. So, yeah, it's those great drivers really do absorb everything and learn and apply it and use it to their advantage. Like you said, it's the overall package that wins the race.
I do think that changing to inters in the middle of a race around the time that Ferrari did it was an okay strategy because the track was still wet then, but the race was still long enough that by the time they got to the end of the race, those inters were inter drives. Um, Whereas the people who were pitting later than Ferrari towards the end of the race, their inters were staying inters and an inter is a few seconds a lap slower than an inter dry. Um, so kudos to Ferrari because we don't get to say that a whole lot.
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
and commiserations to Red Bull because before I saw that Hamilton was likely going to win the race, I think even before the halfway point, you started to get the impression that Racing Point weren't going to win it. You saw, the likes of Albon in third and Verstappen starting to make up ground, and then they threw it away.
Yeah, I have to admit, we talked about our bias earlier. I'm not a fan of Stroll all that much, though he has performed well at times. Much rather would have seen uh, Perez win that race. So I wasn't exactly sad when Stroll fell by the wayside and Perez kept going and was at least up there.
Although Racing Point have pointed out that he did have damage to his car.
Yeah.
But granted, the car didn't start with damage, so um, Stroll picked that up, which was
Yeah.
kind of he can be blamed for that. But go ahead.
uh, the one that intrigued me that I really was hoping for a brief moment was actually Albon. Albon for a short while looked like he had a shot at a
Yeah.
win. And that was another one. Again, it's like, man, so much stuff in this race. It was like you had someone to cheer for, no matter who you were or who you enjoyed as a fan. And Albon is one who's, another. I'm a sucker for underdogs, and even though he hasn't been performing, I want to see him perform and really make it clear that he deserves his Red Bull seat. And I was hoping when he got up to the front, I was like, oh, this is his chance. He can seal the deal. And fortunately, it wasn't meant to be. But for a brief while, there was a glimmer of hope.
Considering the fact that he didn't finish up the order for Lance Stroll, arguably behind Hamilton, maybe even on par with Hamilton, the best drivers of the day were eh, Leclerc a little bit, but Vettel,
Yes.
Stroll, and Perez, and Sainz, who finished quite highly up there. And so you're talking about the two drivers that are going to be racing for Ferrari next year, Leclerc and Sainz. The two drivers who are going to be racing for Aston Martin next year, um, Vettel and Perez, putting on good performances. Sorry, Vettel
Stroll.
and Stroll.
I wish Perez was staying.
And that's exactly the point I was trying to get to. The one driver who put on a great performance in a race when the conditions were poor and you got to show your driver's talent was Sergio Perez, beating everybody but Lewis Hamilton, and still doesn't have a ride confirmed for next season. Though we all feel bad for Albon at times for being compared as Verstappen's teammate, there is part of me that's thinking, I hope Perez gets that second Red Bull seat. I can't remember what our conclusion was on that episode we did a couple of months ago, Joe, when we were going through all the teams.
My mind went to that as I was
Yeah.
watching it, honestly, watching the race. And truth be told, I'm with you. I don't think I'd be bummed to see Alex, lose out to the seat after only a year and a half. But I would be ecstatic to see Perez to get a shot in a top running car, or at least hopefully a top running car. We'll see how the engine holds up next year with Honda, dipping after that.
Well, that pretty much wraps up everything that happened up front in the Formula One race. I also want to give a shout out to Joe Mir, who was a bit of an underdog rider that people outside of MotoGP probably never have heard of, who went on to win the MotoGP championship last weekend. So kudos to him on the rider picking up the spoils when Marc Marquez has been out for the season with an injury. Well, Joe, we have a few races left in the 2020 Formula One World Championship. The championship title has been wrapped up. What are the stories you're really looking forward to seeing get wrapped up here, get tied up in the final few races?
A lot of what we've been talking about, seeing what happens is with the early silly season, I guess you could call it, and who winds up where based on their performances. I think those are definitely going to be intriguing. I feel like the tracks themselves are a little bit of a talking point because we still have Bahrain, and remember they're going to do the long outer loop, or well, short outer loop, I guess you
Yeah.
could call it. And I'm very curious to see how that's going to play out. I feel like we've talked about that on the show, but I think that's going to be a fun one.
I'm curious to see how Ferrari ends the season. Obviously, I'm a bit of a Ferrari fan, but I think, they were definitely caught off guard at the start of the season. I think they have been more competitive than we've given them credit for. Obviously, they've still made a couple of pit stop blunders recently, but it seems they're making less strategy blunders. I can't. Maybe I'm forgetting a couple of things, but it seems like they're starting to get their act together. They're starting to get their car better, and I'm curious to see how they end the season and if they can take that momentum to be a front runner in the car again in 2021.
Some of that, I wonder if it's perspective as well, because when you're in the limelight, it's easy to see those blunders. But the teams that are farther down, we don't often talk about strategically they lost this race because we're not as focused, and it's a little harder when you're in the mid pack to kind of suss out what was the right call and what wasn't. So I think some of that is helping them in that sense, and that's not to put them down necessarily. Just saying, I think like the fact that they're making less strategic blunders may be partly down to the fact that they don't have to worry about that. The pressure's not on, and it's not so minutely discussed the way it has been in past seasons.
Well, honestly, no matter how great an outfit is, they can always make mistakes and blunders and look like an embarrassment. And we are not immune. We are going to end this episode with a look back at how we tried to start this darn thing. So, Joe, I just want to make a disclaimer that in the past we have made. Now, Joe, in the past we have not hidden at all our. F***ing hell. Hello, everyone. My name is Samuel's Racing Show. No, it's not.
Hey Sam, glad to be back on the show again.
No, I don't need to do it for.